Good morning, Rick Greene, Development Services Director, and I love public speaking. So what I'd like to do is quickly go through our annexation study. I believe the commissioners were left a copy of it on Friday. But I'll begin by indicating we were just talking about strategic planning. And again, as part of our efforts when we were doing strategic planning a while ago, we had identified 6 functional areas, and then we had identified a total of 16 strategic priorities the city was going to pursue. City annexation study was one of those 16, so I'm pleased to say we'll have the first one completed. So as part of that process, we did identify and prepare a summary, so we created a team lead, a cross-functional planning team, and discussed a summary of what our intention was with the annexation study. So with the cross-functional team, Alex Hansen serves as the lead for this team, Angela Van, our planning and zoning administrator, and then Caroline Glass, who did a wonderful job with the graphics. But these folks work with me, and I was very pleased with the result. Kevin Volbrick in engineering worked with us, Dathan in finance, Peter Ledoux in fire, Kimberly Rothenberg in law, Joe Ahern in police, and Punim in public utilities. So as we were going through this process, we met with them to get their input, because certainly the properties that we annex are going to be impacted by police and fire, engineering, etc. So the study itself, going through the table of contents, we talk about the strategic planning process. We talk about state regulations regarding annexations. We talk a little bit about the history of what we've done in West Palm Beach. We talk about interlocal agreements, and Alex will touch upon that because we have agreements with Palm Beach County, with Riviera Beach, etc. I'll talk a little bit about our annexation history dating back to 1988. And then what we did is we actually analyzed 559 parcels. And in the appendix of the report that you have, you will see that we've done an analysis of each of those parcels. So you will see an aerial, you'll see a ground photo of the parcel. We'll talk about the value of that property, how it's being served by police and fire and water. And then more importantly, at the end, we also have the property appraiser market value, and then if that property was annexed into the city, the amount of revenue that the city would receive. And then at the conclusion of the study, we also looked at the 559 parcels, and then we identified a preferred desire to immediately target the properties reflected in the green color. The properties in the yellow color were contingent upon something else happening. In other words, we might have to annex a piece of property to get to the yellow parcel. And the ones reflected in the orange are those that we should not pursue at this time, or at least our recommendation, we should not pursue at this time. So why annex? Why talk about annexation? So there's several reasons. So if you look at the map to the top right, you see this is Military Trail, Okeechobee Boulevard. You see how disjointed our boundary is. So one of the reasons that cities annex is to square off boundaries. Not that we're going to pursue every parcel here, but certainly if you have a more compact and defined city boundary, it makes it easier for city services. Certainly with any annexation, you have an increased ad valorem tax base, you have additional utility taxes, franchise fees, and again, as we enter into the 2020 census, obviously, the more people we have in the city of West Palm Beach, the more revenue we can derive. And then there's a variety of miscellaneous other revenue sources. So again, we looked at the 559 parcels. Again, if you look at the map on the top right, every city in Palm Beach County has what they call a target annexation area. So ours is defined by the red area. It actually goes down to Southern Boulevard. Certainly other cities will have a defined annexation area that might overlap ours. So this is something that, as we're looking at parcels, one of the things we have to look at. So within annexation, you have to identify, is it politically feasible? Is it technically feasible? In other words, do we have the capability, the funding to deliver services to that property that might be annexed? And then certainly, is it economically feasible? We don't want to annex a piece of property that's going to end up costing the city more money to serve. So these are 3 of the factors that we look at with any annexation, and part of what we looked at in the review of the 559 properties. So just a real quick history. The last study we did was back in 2003, and one of the results that came out of that study was a waiving of any fees associated with the annexation process. So as parcels come into the city, they have to seek a city zoning category, a city land use category, And based on that study, we have not been charging fees. So one of the incentives that we do offer for properties that are considering coming into the city of West Palm Beach. Since 1988, we have annexed 52 properties into the city. During the 90s, we annexed these 14 properties. In the 2000s, in the yellow, you see the green the next decade, and in this past decade, those in the purple. So some of the biggest annexations we've had dating back to 1988 certainly include Ibis back in 1989, 1,876 acres. I was here at the city at the time. We even tried to get the Bay Hill development to the west of this. We were unsuccessful, and they just recently annexed into Palm Beach Gardens just a year ago. Certainly MacArthur Foundation was another one at 551 acres, also in 1989. And then the Rolfs development, which eventually became Oakton, Bay Winds, and Andros. For those of you who may not know, but Henry Rolfs, whose statue is sitting on Okeechobee Boulevard right now, prior to Rosemary Square and City Place, he tried to develop a project on the same property where Rosemary Square sits today, called Downtown Uptown. It was 3.7 million square feet of development. He sold a lot of this property, annexed it into the city. That helped bankroll that project. Unfortunately, it failed and did not move forward, but Rosemary Square sits there today. And then, of course, Riverwalk came in a couple years after that in 1993. So these four major annexations comprise 90% of everything we've annexed since 1988. Subsequent to the Riverwalk annexation in 93, we annexed only 374 acres because, as you can imagine, it gets tougher as you move forward. But all in all, since 1988, we've annexed 52 properties over almost 6,500 acres into the city of West Palm Beach. We, as part of this exercise, focused on 6 areas in particular. So we have Okeechobee Boulevard west of the Turnpike, and we have a parcel that we're negotiating right now called the Grace Church. I think Alex may touch upon that. Haverhill around Roebuck Road, there's some properties we're looking at there. 45th Street in Haverhill, Military Trail and Community, Okeechobee Boulevard and Military Trail, and then we have a really funky piece that I'll ask Alex to talk about at the 45th Street Flea Market. So at this point, let me turn it over to Alex, and we'll take it from there, and then I'll sum up at the end.
Thank you, Rick. So Chapter 171 of the Florida Statutes is the one that governs annexations in the state of Florida. Annexations have to be coordinated with Palm Beach County and include also the county's consistency review with Chapter 171. After all, every parcel that we would like to annex is today within the county's boundaries. There are 4 different types of annexations. I'm going to mention in more detail 2 of the most common ones, the 2 most common ones. The first one is voluntary annexations. This is when a property owner petitions an adjacent municipality to be annexed. Chapter 171 indicates that this annexation or this piece of land must be contiguous, reasonably compact, and must not create enclaves. I'm going to define those terms in a couple of slides. We also have what is called the involuntary or referendum annexation. These are annexations that necessitate or need a referendum or consent from more than 50% of the property owners to be annexed. The other 2 is called the legislative annexation and the interlocal annexation. But again, they're not that common, so that's why I'm not touching upon them. Rick briefly mentioned that we do have some agreements or some previous annexation interlocal agreements that we have entered into with both Riviera Beach as well as with Palm Beach County. These were entered into 20 years ago. A couple of them were renewed within the last decade. These annexation agreements or interlocal agreements do affect the city's ability to annex certain properties and or provide water and sewer services, regardless of whether these properties are annexed into the city limits. Since, as Rick indicated, since 1988, the city has processed a total of 52 annexations, totaling over 6,400 acres. And there has been obviously a decrease in the amount of acreage annexed. A lot of this is because many of the large tracts of land are no longer next to our municipal limits. Those annexations, as Rick went over, happened mostly in the late 80s, early 90s. As far as the existing service agreements, or as well as the service area boundaries, we have some here, the maps showing the police, fire, as well as water service area boundaries. Some of these are affected or would be affected by these interlocal agreements that I referenced. Not so much police and fire, but mostly water. So we have some, as part of this agreement, there's some delineation, especially around Okeechobee Boulevard out west, Military Trail, Haverhill, and the 45th Street area that limits the city's ability to expand our service area. So even if some of the parcels that I'm going to mention in a few minutes are to be annexed, that doesn't necessarily mean that the city's water and service areas would be changed. These agreements, again, would limit the ability of the city to provide water and sewer to some of these parcels. I mentioned earlier that some of the state requirements refer that any parcel that is annexed must be contiguous. Well, Chapter 170, as well as compact, well, Chapter 171 does define contiguous. This is a substantial part of a boundary of the territory sought to be annexed, has to be coterminous with a part of the boundary municipality. In this case, this parcel that we have shown here in red is not contiguous today to the city limit. So we couldn't annex this parcel unless some other parcels that are adjacent to the city limits, which are shown in yellow here, are expanded. Compactness, a parcel that is compact is defined as concentration of a piece of a property in a single area and precludes any action which will create enclaves, pockets, or finger areas and serpentine patterns. So, sorry, as far as enclaves too, is defined as any unincorporated, improved, or developed area that is enclosed within and bounded on all sides by a single municipality. The example that we have here in orange, if we were to annex this parcel or group of parcels here in orange, we would be creating an enclave. So this area here would now be bounded on all four sides by, that is outlined in red, would be bounded on all four sides by the city, but would be, again, an enclave of unincorporated land. So state statutes preclude this situation from happening. The other definition is the one of a finger. Actually, Chapter 171 does not define finger, but other sections of the state language do indicate that it's a significant or extreme departure of extension of property resulting in non-compact or non-contiguous arrangement of municipal property. So in red, you have an example what would be considered a finger. Rick mentioned briefly the 6 priority areas that staff identified for annexation. I'm going to go into detail on some of this. So area 1 is the area around Okeechobee, west of the Turnpike. Again, we also prioritize the different parcels that were in these different areas. So the areas in green are the parcels, or the parcels in green are the parcels that we believe we could pursue in the near future for annexations. We do not see any obstacles from a legal standpoint or economic standpoint from the city pursuing the annexation. The parcels in yellow are those parcels that would be contingent upon other factors. For example, some of the parcels that we identify here in yellow are not immediately adjacent to the city limits, so we may first need to annex parcels that are immediately adjacent to the city limits before we annex some of these parcels in yellow. Another example would be these ones. If we annex these parcels here, which are south of Okeechobee Boulevard first, we'll be creating an enclave for the parcels that are immediately to the north that are here in yellow. So again, the parcels in green would need to be annexed prior to the parcels in yellow being annexed.
Alex, if you could also mention the Grace Fellowship parcel on the far west, that's an application that's come in. It's a church property which wouldn't pay taxes, but they do own a long vacant tract adjacent to the church parcel that they've discussed maybe redeveloping in some form. So that's going through our process.
And the parcels in orange are parcels that we do not believe at this time we can pursue annexation for a number of different reasons. In the case here, this is the Vista Center complex on the northeast corner of Drug Road and Okeechobee. This is a planned development under the county's jurisdiction. We couldn't annex just one or a few of the parcels here. We have to annex the whole complex. It becomes very challenging, we think, to get the willingness of the property owners, which includes the county, to be annexed for all of this area. So again, this is the first area, Okeechobee Boulevard west of the Turnpike. We're talking mostly parcels on the south side of Okeechobee Boulevard, west of the Turnpike. The city limits already go south of Okeechobee, but we're seeking, again, the expansion. As Rick indicated, Grace Fellowship, right now we're processing an application for a voluntary annexation. Area 2, this is Haverhill around Roebuck Road. We're talking about just a handful of parcels. This is mostly on the west side, or exclusively on the west side of Haverhill. There's a few residential parcels or vacant parcels. This is north of Roebuck Road, and then at the southwest corner of Roebuck Road and Haverhill, we have also a small shopping plaza. We think there's a possibility for annexation there. The reason why we identified in yellow, there's a small strip of land here that is actually part of this residential Cypress Lakes community that we may need to do something about before we could pursue the annexation of the shopping plaza in this area. Area 3 is mostly parcels fronting either on 45th Street or Haverhill Road. This is again in the area between Military Trail and Haverhill Road. Most of these parcels are residential. There's a few commercial or a few institutional uses.
And Alex, before you leave that, if you go back, commissioners may remember that we recently annexed the prime property at the northwest corner of 45th Street and Military. So it's the area in blue. That portion that Alex is identifying was in the county just a year ago.
The fourth area that we identified is around Military Trail and Community Drive. There's a lot of parcels here. Some are institutional, a couple of residential properties, or mostly a mobile home park. There's the Oxbridge Academy. So the Oxbridge Academy, a small portion of the academy is actually the northern part here, is already within the city limits. The Oxbridge Academy, I believe in 2012, came to annex this piece here, and at the time they indicated to City Commission that their intent was to annex the rest of the school. This is a private high school. At the time, it was owned by the Jewish Federation, the land there, so they indicated that as soon as the Oxbridge Academy acquired this parcel, they would come in for annexation of the rest of the school. That actual change of ownership happened 7 or 8 years ago. However, Oxbridge Academy has not pursued the annexation. We have contacted them, and they indicated at this point they're not going to pursue it. The reason why we believe the annexation of Oxbridge is important to the city is not so much from a tax standpoint, because being a school, we wouldn't get any tax revenue from the annexation of Oxbridge, but there's several other parcels south of there that we could annex if Oxbridge Academy were to be within the city limits. Then Area 5, this is on the northeast corner of Military Trail and Okeechobee Boulevard. Mostly industrial or commercial areas. There's a mobile home park that is identified here in orange. But again, a lot of these would square off the city boundaries. This is one of the examples that Rick mentioned when he was talking about squaring off city limits. The sixth one, which is somewhat different, somewhat unique, the sixth area, this is a portion of the 45th Street flea market. So right now, 80 to 90% of the flea market, which is this area here, is actually within the city of West Palm Beach limits, but there's about 15% of the market that is actually within the limits of Mangonia Park. So even portions of a building that are within city limits, and then the other portion, this is within the Mangonia Park boundaries, and then the rest is within the city of West Palm Beach limits. We believe that it is in the city's best interest that the entire plaza be within the city of West Palm Beach limits. One challenge here is this is not just an outright annexation, because this parcel, a portion of this parcel is already within the limits of Mangonia Park. So Mangonia Park will first have to de-annex the portion in yellow within their city limits, and after that, the city of West Palm Beach could annex this. That way, the entire plaza would be within the city of West Palm Beach's limits. As far as considerations for future annexations, again, some of these annexation and service agreements that I mentioned with Riviera Beach and the county may limit some of the things that we can do. Another important aspect, and Rick will get into more detail on this, is about the city's millage rate. Our millage rate is higher than the county's, so any property that is today in unincorporated Palm Beach County and then annexes into the city would be paying more in taxes. As far as potential city incentives for annexations, we have identified a handful of primary incentives. The first one is that the city's planning and zoning regulations generally allow for a higher development potential than the county. So we may allow more residential density or more non-residential intensity than what the county allows. Typically our development review approval process is faster or quicker than the county's. And there's also the possibility for the city commission to offer abatement on the city's property taxes for several years if a parcel annexes into the city. And Rick will get into some more details about this. In addition, we have a handful of other potential economic development incentives or programs that some of these parcels could make use of if they were to annex into the city limits. In summary, I believe now Rick is going to get into.
So in summary, there are 38 parcels that we've identified in green. Those are the ones we would like to pursue at this time. 108 properties that were identified in yellow that are contingent on something else happening, so that constitutes the 559. So certainly today, we would like to ask the commission if they're okay with the annexation study. We would seek your direction in moving forward. And then the question we would like to ask is the city willing to consider tax abatement for annexed properties? So if we go to the next slide, you'll see we just did some hypotheticals. So let's say that there's a shopping center that we may be considering annexing based on the millage rate. That owner is paying $17,200 to the county. They're paying $21,637 to the city. So a difference of $4,400 being in the county versus being in the city. Just a hypothetical, if there was to be a 1 mil difference between city and county, that would equate, in this example, about $1,000. But certainly if we can offer tax abatement for a period of 3 or 4 or 5 years where they're not paying taxes, it's revenue we're not seeing anyway because it's in the county. But if we could maybe dangle that incentive, in addition to the other incentives that Alex mentioned, that's something that we certainly would like to consider and pursue. So that concludes our presentation. If you'd like to look at any of these areas in more detail, we can provide a different link where we can zoom in or out or any of the parcels. But
any questions, commissioners? Commissioner Riles.
Has anyone looked at the demographics of the various areas you want to annex?
we have not, Commissioner.
You see, because my concern is, given the fact that we still have segregated housing patterns in this community, that these annexations could easily dilute the African-American vote. Has that been a consideration at all?
We have not. We're simply looking at physical boundaries at this time.
One note, I want to say probably about 90% of the parcels that we have identified are actually non-residential. So the number of residential units that would be annexed, at least that we have identified in these 6 areas, is relatively limited.
And then a lot of them are vacant as well.
Several are vacant, but
Yeah, Commissioner Buzzi?
Thank you for the presentation. I think that the areas in Greene are a good start. I'm still concerned that there's significantly large pockets of unincorporated areas, around our city that actually, come well into the city itself, that make it problematic for policing and for some other city services, but primarily crime prevention and policing. When you have significant pockets like this where one street is one city and the other is unincorporated, it makes it difficult to have a comprehensive plan for crime prevention and actually going and patrolling areas to prevent crime. So it's one of the areas that I've been talking about, areas of concern of mine. I think the areas in Greene are a good start. I think that if we can continue to identify areas that are potentials for annexation that would continue to shore up our boundaries, and certainly offering incentives, I think, is important because of the fact that our mill rate is significantly higher than the county's. I think we also need to do some public education with regard to some of our existing communities. I was actually approached by a community out west that said, "Hey, Commissioner, we saw what Bay Hill did, and they annexed into Gardens, and we'd like to do the same." And I said, "Well, slow down a little bit. You understand I'm a West Palm Beach commissioner, and the likelihood of West Palm Beach allowing you out of the city are slim to none. So let's talk about what we can do to make you feel like you're a part of the city or to address whatever concerns you have." But I certainly think part of that issue, part of the reason why they felt that way probably is because of our millage rate. So it's certainly something we need to, if we want to attract these bordering areas into our city, I think we need to take a serious look at offering those incentives.
Commissioner Shove?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the presentation. I just want to make one point of clarification on the request. The intent is to do tax abatement for the difference between the county and the city. So these parcels would, in essence, pay the county rate for some number of years to be determined, not pay no taxes, correct?
Yeah, we haven't identified the program yet, but it could be in some form or fashion, either just the difference or maybe the difference plus if that incentive is needed. Certainly, we'd have to bring that back to the commission, but.
Sure, and I think, part of the request was some direction, and I'll speak from my point of view. I think it comes on a case-by-case basis. Some of the annexations that we've considered have had projects along with them.
Correct.
And so, I think that brings some value back into our tax base. The thing that I would be concerned about is we hear a lot about the maintenance of the areas that we already have. And so I want to be mindful to make sure that we are taking care of everything that we have, but also looking at those opportunities as they come along. If they represent a project or a building or some development that we think would be beneficial to the tax base, then certainly offering an incentive would be appropriate. And so I guess from this position, my request would be on a case-by-case basis of taking a look to see what incentive package is appropriate for whatever annexation we're looking at.
Right. Yeah,
Well, each particular annexation request will come back to us.
sure, because again,
to look at.
you would have to vote on the annexation, so we would want to delineate what that program would be, bring it back to the commission as part of the discussion. A good example, Commissioner, is the southeast corner of Community Drive and Military Trail where the Shell gas station was. The racetrack, Raceway wanted to go into the county, and that they wouldn't allow that development to happen in the county. It was permitted in our zoning. So that was a piece of property that was annexed. We didn't offer any incentives, but to your point, it came with a project. Just like the Grace Church out on Okeechobee is the same thing. But for those more difficult projects or parcels like the ones identified on this graphic in yellow, there's going to have to be some incentive, because otherwise, based on the disparity in the millage rate, there's no incentive for them to come into the city and pay more in taxes.
Sure, and I guess to reiterate my position, I wouldn't be opposed to considering some incentive. I don't think I could sit here and say there's a program across the board that I think is a one-stop shop for
Fair
everybody.
enough, exactly.
But as staff reviews and comes back with a recommendation, that would be something I would be willing to consider.
Okay, any other, Madam President?
Thank you. And to the point that you're looking for feedback from us about the incentive, I agree. I think we could look at it on a case-by-case basis, but just making sure that we also get information as we're making that decision on the budget, the costs,
we would do that.
as well as the future potential tax base. Just had a question too. I mean, wanted to say thank you so much. This is an extremely thorough presentation and study. How long did this take to put together and to complete the study?
I believe we started in the summer of last year. I was
gonna guess about 6 months.
So 6 months plus.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's very helpful when making these decisions to have this level of detail. Appreciate it.
All right, any other questions, comments? Staff, do you have the direction that you need to go forward?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Very fine presentation.